I walked into my father's lavish retirement party thinking I could at least survive the night. But before I even reached the chandelier-lit ballroom, I heard it whispers slicing through the air like knives. "There's the frigid son who can't do anything right." Then my stepmother's voice, sharp, rehearsed, "Cruel security, remove this useless boy." I didn't fight. I didn't speak. I just walked out, canceled every family-funded account they'd ever drained, and moved my $17 million into a trust with hands that didn't even shake. 5 minutes later, my phone lit up with 56 missed calls. And then came the pounding on my door. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just done with them, they were about to learn who I really was. My name is Caspian Marlowe. And before I tell you everything I want to know, you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments, or tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far my story can reach. Sometimes even the smallest connection can make a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. And if you want to support this channel so more people can find stories like mine, you can hit subscribe. It means more than you know. I walked into the Fairmont ballroom like I was walking into a living photograph, crystal chandeliers, a soft fog of champagne bubbles, a room full of men in navy suits and women who knew exactly how to laugh at the right volume. I wore a dark suit, no jewelry, nothing that screamed Marlowe, because I wanted to shrink into the background and measure the distance between who I was and who they expected me to be. My father stood at the podium, Elliot Marlowe, smiling with the kind of practiced pride you can smell across a room, talking about legacy and handing the keys to the company to Riker Seraphine's son, as if the future was already signed. The whispers started before I reached the center of the room, soft at first, then lubricated into cruelty. "There's the frigid son who can't do anything right." The words landed like a slap, and I heard the sentence as if it were a physical thing. Seraphine smiled in that way she smiles when she knows she's pulling a string on the world. She leaned toward the head of security, and loud enough for the cluster nearest us to hear, said, "Security, remove this useless boy." The guard came over and spoke to me with an apologetic politeness. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't make a scene, I walked out with my head level. I noticed mid-turn that half a dozen phones were pointing toward me and that a local news crew had a live feed running tiny cameras, a phone on a gimbal, a handheld streaming the whole moment. 500 people saw me escorted out. The footage was live, and in my chest something cold and precise clicked into place. In the elevator on the way down, the Fairmont feed blinked on my phone. "Scandal at Fairmont family drama explodes," and there it was. Seraphine's voice ordering security, frozen in pixels and timestamp. I knew in that instant that what happened in that room wasn't going to be hidden. I felt humiliation like a foreign language, but beneath the shame there was a clarity. This public act was a legal trigger. I'd been holding for years, a clause in an old shareholder agreement I hadn't wanted to use but had never destroyed. I stepped out onto the street and made a list in my head of names I would call the moment the elevator doors closed. I took the first call in a taxi with the city blur outside the window and no one to listen but myself. "Theo," I said, "confirm clause 7.3.2 and get ready." Theo Langford, the corporate attorney who wrote the amendment years ago when my father had been desperate for capital, answered in a voice that made me feel less alone. "I'll open it now. Don't say anything. Preserve everything." Next, I called Maya Chen at Helios, my COO, and in 3 sentences she understood the scope: pull 15 years worth of wire confirmations and bank statements, freeze any auto transfers tied to family-designated accounts, secure our filings, and prepare an ownership map that shows every increment of purchase through the 6 entities I'd used. My third call was to my private banker, lock all outgoing family-designated disbursements, set a freeze on cards tied to Seraphine and Riker, and move $17 million into the Marlowe Independent Trust under an independent trustee. I barely let the words finish before the transfers were in motion. Money behaved like a patient animal when guided. As the taxi threaded through Nob Hill, I thought of the evidence I had to present, the things I'd cataloged over the years. Wire confirmations broken down by purpose, Hampton mortgage payments, yacht maintenance, private jet leases, boutique charges, charity gala invoices, all attached to emails and texts from Seraphine, demanding immediacy with dates and times. The SEC filings that, when aligned, showed purchases of Marlowe Realty stock through Meridian Holdings, Cascade Investments, Paramount, Zenith, Aurora, and Evergreen Trust, each under the disclosure threshold, but together forming a 31% block. The original shareholder agreement with Clause 7.3.2, Elliott's signature on the bottom of the page, and the clip from the Fairmont with a clear timestamp and a witness list that included judges, senators, and investment partners. Theo told me he would draft and file the emergency shareholder meeting notice under that clause. Legal wheels heaved into motion, and Maya instructed PR to assemble a backgrounder for financial press and prepare controlled leaks so that the narrative didn't become something else's story. Still beneath the tactical moves, a voice in my chest asked the ugly question, will this look like revenge? I told myself it wasn't revenge. It was protection for the company, for the employees, for the pensioners whose mortgages we held. Halfway through organizing the pieces, I found a discrepancy that made my stomach tighten. One of the 6 shell entities that had acquired stock showed up in a registry entry under a fund name that on paper belonged to Marlowe Family Trusts. Someone inside the family's circle had either made a clerical mistake or was quietly covering for me, and either possibility shifted the chessboard. If it was a mistake, it was ammunition. If it was deliberate, someone on the inside had known more than they admitted. Right as I logged that discovery, an anonymous email came through from Ava Sinclair, a journalist whose byline I respected. Attached was a packet internal expense reports that documented client entertainment items funneled into personal accounts for Riker. Her note was blunt. She had the story ready to run unless we coordinated. She offered to hold publication if I wanted to use the moment to call the meeting and control the release. Suddenly, the media was a lever I could use, but it was also a blade that could cut my hand if I misjudged the timing. I sat in my apartment later that night, the Marlowe skyline visible beyond the glass, and arranged the evidence like an architect plotting a building. Every wire, every email, every filing, every time-stamped clip had to interlock. I would call the meeting. I would trigger the clause. But I would not confuse justice with vengeance. That had been my promise to myself the day I decided to stop being invisible. I spent the next hours building a case like a surgeon assembling instruments, deliberate, clinical, methodical. Theo filed the notice of emergency meeting with precise language that made my stomach tighten when I read it back. He spelled out the triggering conditions of Clause 7.3.2, cited the time-stamped video from the Fairmont, and demanded a shareholder session within 72 hours. Maya worked through the night compiling SEC filings, packing a slide deck that mapped every incremental purchase through Meridian, Cascade, Paramount, Zenith, Aurora, and Evergreen, and lining up a clean timeline that paired each wire confirmation to the emails and texts from Seraphine. Lucas called Bloomberg, the Journal, and CNBC and asked them to save room on their schedules. He framed the meeting as a corporate governance emergency, not a family spectacle. I called Jennifer Martinez and a few old auditors whose names I'd kept in the back of a drawer. They agreed to review the files and, if necessary, testify about irregular expense lines labeled as client entertainment. The family answered with force. Seraphine's attorneys filed for an injunction to block the meeting and sent urgent notices to our banking partners claiming I intended to cripple operations. Social feeds lit up with accusations that I was unstable, grasping, jealous of Riker, that I wanted to destroy the company for spite. Institutional investors called my phone and asked blunt questions about the origin of the $17 million. I walked them through the provenance the best I could without revealing strategic moves and asked them to hold until the meeting. Then the boardroom theater began to shift. Harrison Mitchell, a longtime independent director, gave an interview where he called me a destabilizing force. For a moment I felt the floor move. But Maya sent a screen grab of an internal message she'd intercepted from the family's legal team. Harrison had privately written, quietly, "I'm tired of their plan," and the context suggested he was playing a role to protect himself while waiting for hard evidence. Relief came with a price. The leaks started to multiply. Late that night, Ava published an excerpt showing how client entertainment lines had been redirected into personal accounts tied to Riker. The markets reacted, headlines asked hard questions, and then someone inside the family pushed a narrative back, a forged-looking memo implying that the $17 million I'd moved to trust was entangled with Helios accounts, an implication that I'd manipulated company control with my own corporate vehicle. I was forced into damage control. Theo prepared affidavits proving the transfers were from my personal accounts. Lucas curated the PR timeline to emphasize lawful behavior, and Maya tightened the ownership map so anyone reading could see the chain of custody. Still, as the clock wound down toward 72 hours, I knew the danger wasn't only external. I had letters of proxy from a handful of shareholders tired of nepotism. The media had a story it wanted to run, and Ava had agreed to hold if we controlled the narrative. Everything was in place, but the family would not capitulate quietly. I locked the evidence folder, inhaled, and moved my pieces on the board, aware that every move after this would either close the loop or blow the whole thing into smoke. The next morning began with 3 calls from the family's law firm informing me that a temporary restraining order had been filed and that a hearing was scheduled that afternoon. Simultaneously, a barrage of social posts accused me of fabricating evidence and dredged up personal rumors. Riker posted a stream of video clips and accusations meant to paint me as erratic and unfit to hold any corporate responsibility. I called Theo first. He ran through the math and legal precedent and told me the injunction was unlikely to be granted because Clause 7.3.2 was explicit, and public humiliation was easily demonstrable with the Fairmont footage, but he warned me the family would try everything to delay or muddy the waters. I told Maya to prepare a clear comparison of company performance under my father's recent directions versus the actual numbers that showed expenses exploding in lines associated with Riker's projects. Meanwhile, anonymous emails started to arrive from middle managers, frightened notes, spreadsheets with red flags circled pleas for protection. One of them included a scheduling request from the company's private ledger showing a $3.2 million transfer routed through a consulting line to an offshore account with Seraphine's name on the beneficiary list. I reread it twice and felt a cold certainty. Elliot appeared at Helios unannounced that afternoon, walking into my office with the weathered confidence of a man who expected obedience. He did not ask for conversation. He delivered an ultimatum veiled as a warning. If you continue down this path, I will make public the fact you were treated for depression when you were 24. For a second, I felt the old shrapnel of shame, but then anger replaced fear. He would drag my private health history into the street if it served him. I understood then how far he was willing to go. I had evidence that could bring his empire down: a leaked email from his lawyers showing Seraphine's emergency transfer videos from the company cameras of Riker berating staff, and a cached file showing how public relations had been used to mask internal drain. But I also had to be strategic. Exposing the $3.2 million immediately might break their leverage, but it might also allow them to call me vindictive and divert attention. I chose to hold to bring the full mosaic to the meeting, not scatter fragments into the press where they could be misread. As night fell, a new message arrived on an unlisted number. Be careful of the people you think are on your side. One of them is feeding the family. The sentence was a small bomb. I stared at the screen until my reflection blurred and realized that beyond the courtroom and headlines, the most dangerous thing was uncertainty inside my own ranks. I tightened access, revoked credentials, and began a quiet review of every person who had handled the ownership map, the filings, the wire confirmations. Trust had always been the currency of my life. Now it was the most volatile asset I owned. I got to the office at 5 in the morning, long before the sun even bothered to rise because sleep had given up on me hours earlier. I sat alone in the glass conference room with the city still dark outside, reviewing the short list of people who had access to the ownership files: Maya, Theo, Lucas, and the 2 analysts handling SEC submissions. It struck me how small the circle was, yet how porous trust could become when fear and money got involved. I went name by name, replaying conversations, glances, inconsistencies. By the time Maya walked in with 2 coffees, my nerves felt pulled thin. She slid one to me, and her expression told me the day wasn't going to be kind. She said several large shareholders had been swayed back toward my father's side because the family was circulating a narrative that I was mentally unstable, incapable of leading, prone to collapse. They were weaponizing pieces of my past the same way they'd weaponized my presence at the Fairmont. Hearing it shifted the entire vote count in my head, numbers rearranging into something far less certain. Then came the message from an unknown sender, a video file of Riker cornering a junior financial analyst, his voice sharp and frantic, ordering him to alter ledgers to hide a $2.9 million transfer. The footage was grainy but unmistakably real. The problem was its origin. Nothing about the file looked clean, and using it without understanding how it was obtained could invite another storm. Still, it was proof of what we'd long suspected. As I replayed the clip, Ava called to tell me a major investigation on Marlowe Realty was scheduled to publish within 24 hours, focusing on the Denver development that had drawn multiple lawsuits. She warned the impact on the markets could be brutal, and that both sides of the family war would take collateral damage. I asked her to hold to give me time to get through the meeting. It was the first time I'd asked a reporter to delay truth for strategy, and the request sat heavily in my chest. The question that had been circling me for days pressed harder: was I crossing that line my father had crossed years ago, where winning mattered more than integrity? I'd spent a lifetime trying not to become the kind of man who buried problems instead of confronting them. I didn't want my story to be about rot covered with polish. In the middle of that moral wrestling, Theo called. His voice had that clipped edge it only carried when he'd uncovered something dangerous. He found an auxiliary clause in the shareholder agreement, one I had never seen, allowing my father to delegate full voting authority to a named direct heir under specific emergency conditions. And the heir in question, of course, was Riker. If activated, they could override the vote before we ever reached the meeting room. The idea that Elliot had hidden a mechanism like that didn't surprise me, but the timing of its discovery felt almost surgical. The day wrapped itself into knots I didn't have the energy to untangle. Long after most of the building had gone dark, Maya stepped into my office and closed the door behind her. She didn't speak at first. When she did, her voice was quieter than usual. Someone had approached her with an offer to buy the entire ownership map. She turned it down, but in doing so discovered that Lucas had already made a copy of the files without authorization. I asked if she was sure. She nodded, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. It wasn't suspicion anymore. Betrayal had stepped fully into the light. One of my own had been feeding the people trying to bury me. I realized then that the vote wasn't the only thing I could lose. My sense of judgment was already cracking. Later that afternoon, the court issued its ruling. The family had failed to block the shareholder meeting. We were allowed to proceed within the 72-hour requirement. But the judge also granted their request for preliminary review, meaning I had to submit part of my evidence for examination. It increased the risk of leaks, but it also meant the court deemed the matter significant enough to monitor closely. I wondered briefly how many judges had watched the Fairmont clip before making that call. Just as I allowed myself a small breath, my phone buzzed with a message from my father. His words were simple. "We have activated the inheritance provision. Voting authority is now in Riker's hands." It felt like a blow aimed under the ribs. They had found a way to weaponize the auxiliary clause before we could even challenge it. Loss of control wasn't theoretical anymore. It was an active threat. Theo worked quickly, sketching out a legal argument to nullify the inheritance clause by proving Elliot had breached fiduciary duty, citing the offshore transfers tied to Seraphine and the falsified reports connected to Riker. If Clause 7.3.2 was deemed triggered by the humiliation at the Fairmont, every special privilege added after the original agreement could collapse. The legal scaffolding was complex but possible. Still, I could feel time compressing around us. That evening, I found a USB drive in an envelope left outside my office. No note beyond a single sentence. Not everyone here is as stupid as they think. The drive contained months of internal footage: Riker shouting at employees, Seraphine slipping documents into her purse on nights she claimed to be at charity events, Elliot pressuring accountants into altering quarterly numbers. It was an unfiltered view into what Marlowe Realty had become. Holding it, I felt both gratitude and unease. Whoever had sent it wanted the truth exposed, but I had no idea whether they wanted to help me or simply watch the family implode from the inside. Before I could process that, alerts flashed on my phone. Authorities in Denver had expanded their investigation into the real estate project tied to the lawsuits, and the names listed in the notice included my father, Seraphine Riker, and mine. Years earlier, I had approved a small investment in the early stage of that project at Elliot's request. A signature that had meant nothing at the time was now a thread being pulled by federal agents. If I couldn't distinguish my involvement from theirs, I wouldn't just lose the company. I could lose my freedom. I stood in my office long after midnight, looking out at the bay, the city swallowing the last lights of the evening. Everything had changed. The meeting wasn't just about reclaiming power or correcting wrongdoing. It had become something far more personal and far more dangerous. My reputation, my work, my ability to live without this family's shadow, all of it was on the line. I whispered to myself almost too quietly to hear over the hum of the city below that I wouldn't let them drag me under. Not after everything they'd taken. Not after everything they'd done. I would end this not for victory, but for survival. My father sat at the center of the long executive table posture, rigid expression, smooth with confidence. He believed the inheritance provision had handed full voting control to Riker. Beside him, Seraphine wore the smug certainty of someone who thought she'd already won, while Riker's attempt at composure cracked around the edges. He looked like a man bracing for something he couldn't fully see. Harrison Mitchell, the longest-serving independent director, met my eyes from across the room and offered the slightest nod. It wasn't encouragement, it was acknowledgement, a sign that the balance had shifted. Elliot opened the meeting with a speech rehearsed so many times it came out perfectly polished. He accused me of staging a coup, painted me as irrational, unstable, dangerous. He claimed I had manipulated my ownership through covert financial channels and announced that he had invoked the inheritance clause to consolidate the family's voting bloc under Riker. Gasps rippled through the room. Cameras clicked. He looked proud of himself, as if he'd cornered me. When he finished, I stood. I stated who I was, not the frigid son they dismissed, but the chairman of Helios Capital, the owner of 31% of Marlowe Realty through 6 legally structured entities, each compliant with SEC regulations. I laid out the timeline of acquisitions, the filings, the corresponding documentation. Then I played the video from the Fairmont. The ballroom projected across the multiple screens. I watched faces shift as the room saw Seraphine order security to remove me in front of hundreds of witnesses. When the clip ended, the silence was cavernous. I explained that this public humiliation activated Clause 7.3.2. And once activated, every special privilege added afterward, including the inheritance clause, became void due to conflict of interest and breach of fiduciary responsibility. Theo had spent the last 72 hours preparing that opinion, and I watched as the color drained from my father's face. Riker's composure collapsed entirely. He knew what that meant. Then came the evidence. I displayed a detailed accounting of the financial abuses that had hollowed out the company Seraphine, siphoning money through her charity Riker, coercing employees to alter ledgers' personal expenses disguised as corporate obligations. I plugged in the USB and video after video filled the screens. Employees intimidated, documents removed after hours, transfers initiated with no legitimate purpose. Shareholders leaned forward, horrified. The family tried to claim fabrication, but before their denial could build momentum, Jennifer Martinez stood from the second row. Her voice didn't shake. She confirmed every detail and added that she had been threatened repeatedly for trying to report irregularities. Her testimony changed the temperature of the room instantly. Eyes turned on Elliot with something close to revulsion. My father attempted one more strike, accusing me of involvement in the Denver investigation. I answered by presenting an independent audit showing my signature had authorized only a minor early-stage contribution made at his own request. The funds were redirected later by Riker, a fact supported by an internal email instructing accountants to reclassify the project under a temporary discretionary account. The room that had once doubted me now scrutinized every member of my family. With the evidence laid bare, I exercised the right established by Clause 7.3.2, the right to purchase the family's shares at book value. Then, for the sake of the company's stability, I presented an alternative. They could retain 15% ownership but must vacate all governance positions immediately. Riker would be barred from any future role. Seraphine's contracts would be terminated. It was the closest thing to mercy I would offer. Debate broke out among the shareholders. Voices rose, fell, sharpened. But the momentum was unmistakable. Harrison stood and declared that the company could not survive another day under their leadership. His words triggered the vote. Ballots were cast electronically, the tallies appearing live on the screen. As the percentage climbed, I felt the tension in my shoulders loosen one notch at a time. When the count hit exactly 67%, the room erupted not in cheers, but in the collective exhale of people witnessing the end of an era. Elliot rose slowly, as if the weight of the decision pressed down on him physically. Seraphine fled the room first, face twisted with fury. Riker tried to leave but was stopped by two security officers who had been waiting for the signal from the investigators. I watched all of it without triumph. It felt less like victory and more like stepping out from beneath a shadow that had followed me my entire life. I had not toppled them to win. I had done it to breathe. I released a formal statement confirming that Jordan Vale, a seasoned executive from the Singapore division, would take over as CEO. I announced new transparency measures including quarterly independent audits and an employee equity program granting 15% cumulative ownership to staff across all levels. I clarified that I would remain as chairman only with no interest in holding operational control. The company needed institutional leadership, not the shadow of another Marlowe. The consequences for my family arrived swiftly. Riker was detained pending investigation into embezzlement and financial coercion. Seraphine lost control of her charity and was named in multiple fraud complaints. Elliot left the Pacific Heights estate and moved to a quiet home in Lake Tahoe, far removed from the circles that once revered him. None of it gave me satisfaction, but I couldn't deny the justice of it. Later that week, I received an unmarked envelope with a single document inside an old memorandum written by my mother before she passed. In it, she warned that the company she helped build might one day be threatened by those who valued power more than integrity, and that protecting it might fall to me. Reading her words brought a tightness to my chest I hadn't felt in years. She had seen the truth long before I did. She had known what they were capable of. Her message clarified the path forward. I established the Marlowe Independent Foundation using the $17 million I had once used to fund my family's lifestyle. The foundation would support entrepreneurs and individuals who had been silenced, manipulated, or exploited by those in power. Speaking invitations poured in from business schools and ethics programs, and for the first time I said yes. Not because I wanted attention, but because I understood people needed to know how easily corruption could hide behind legacy. As for my father, he wrote several letters, half apology, half justification. I didn't read past the first line of any of them. Forgiveness didn't require reopening the door. It simply required stepping away from it without resentment. One evening I stood on the rooftop of the Helios building looking over San Francisco as the fog curled around the towers. The city felt different, as if it had shifted with me. I realized that freedom wasn't the absence of battle, it was the moment I no longer needed their approval or feared their anger. Everything that had happened had stripped away the illusion that blood alone defined family. I said quietly to myself I didn't destroy them, I just reclaimed what was mine. And with that I closed the chapter on them and opened one meant entirely for me, one built not on inheritance, but on intention. As I stood on the rooftop watching the evening fog settle over the city, I couldn't help but think of all that had led me here. The towering structures below their lights, reflecting the transitions that had taken place in me over the last few months, felt like a mirror to my internal journey. This city, this empire, both built on the dreams and sacrifices of those who came before, but now in my hands transformed. The fight for control, the struggle for recognition, it had all boiled down to one simple truth: freedom. Not the freedom to run away, but the freedom to stand tall and be unshackled by the weight of familial expectations, by the invisible chains that had bound me for so long. For years I had been the frigid son, the disappointment, the one who was always too cold, too rational, never enough. I'd watched as Riker paraded around, celebrated for being charming, for being the one my father believed could fix everything. And all the while I had silently funded their lavish lives, giving and never receiving, never being seen. But now as the soft city lights flickered below, I realized how much more was at stake than just proving a point to my father, my stepmother, or even Riker. This wasn't about them. It was about reclaiming myself, about finally giving myself the recognition I had been denied for so long. The pain of watching them tear me down, belittle me, that had turned into something different now. It wasn't bitterness that filled me. It was clarity. I hadn't just taken control of the company. I had taken control of my own destiny. I had carved a path where my worth didn't depend on anyone's validation but my own. And that was everything. I had fought not just for the company, but for the people who had worked behind the scenes, the ones who had never been recognized, the ones who had built it all with their sweat and dedication. I had done it for the employees who, like me, were hidden in the shadows, underappreciated and overworked. It was time to shift the narrative. Time to remind them that their contributions mattered. This company wasn't just for the elite at the top. It was for everyone who had helped build it from the ground up. The messages I received from employees, some of whom had worked under my father's rule for years, were overwhelming. They were grateful, relieved, even hopeful for the first time in ages. I had broken the cycle of manipulation of entitlement, and they were finally able to breathe. In the midst of all the chaos, those messages became my anchor, grounding me, reminding me of why I fought. I hadn't just defeated the Marlowe dynasty. I had changed the course of its future, and in doing so, I had given them all a voice, a place in the future. Now, as I thought about the future of the company, the foundation I was building, the lives I hoped to touch, I knew that this was just the beginning. The weight of my family's legacy no longer felt like a burden. It felt like the raw material I could use to forge something better, something true. But the truth was, I wasn't doing this for them anymore. I wasn't even doing it for me, not in the way I used to think. I was doing it for all the people who would come after us. The women in finance who needed someone to show them that success didn't require playing by old, outdated rules. The underdog, the misunderstood, the ones like me who were told they'd never be enough. This new chapter wasn't about legacy. It was about legacy building in the right way by ensuring fairness, transparency, and empowerment were at the heart of everything we did.